The morning sun peeked through the curtains as Ruth Anderson opened her eyes. Today marked exactly 35 years since her husband Thomas had passed away. 35 years since he'd made her promise something that had puzzled her ever since. Ruth swung her legs over the side of the bed, her joints protesting as they did every morning. At 78, she had grown accustomed to the daily reminders of her age. The wooden floorboards creaked under her feet as she made her way to the window. From there, she could see it. The old barn that had stood untouched for 3.5 decades. The barn where Thomas had spent so many hours in his final months. The barn he had explicitly forbidden her to enter after his death. "Give it 35 years, he had told her. His voice weakened by illness, but his eyes still bright with that spark that had made her fall in love with him nearly 50 years earlier. "Promise me you won't open that barn for 35 years, after I'm gone." Ruth had agreed, of course. How could she not? Thomas had never asked much of her throughout their 43 years of marriage. If this strange request gave him peace in his final days, she would honor it without question. But that didn't mean she hadn't wondered. Lord, how she had wondered. The coffee maker gurgled in the kitchen as Ruth dressed slowly, choosing her comfortable jeans and a light blue blouse that her granddaughter Lily said brought out her eyes. She wasn't usually one to fuss about her appearance, especially living alone on the farm these days. But today felt important somehow. As she poured her coffee, Ruth glanced at the old rotary phone mounted on the kitchen wall. She should call the kids, let them know what she was planning to do. Her son David had been pestering her about the barn for years, especially after he'd moved his family to Ohio for work. "Mom, that old barn could be worth something," he'd said during his last visit, "or at least the land it's sitting on. You're not getting any younger, and that farm is too much for you to handle alone." He wasn't wrong, but Ruth had made a promise, and in her generation, promises meant something. Her daughter Karen had been more understanding, though equally curious. "Whatever's in there must have been really important to Dad," she'd said once. "I just hope it's not something that'll upset you." Ruth had considered that possibility many times over the years. What could Thomas possibly have hidden that required such a long wait? Was it something that would hurt her? A confession of some kind? She couldn't imagine Thomas keeping secrets. He'd been the most straightforward man she'd ever known. The neighbors had theories, of course. In a small town like Oak Ridge, people noticed things. They'd seen Thomas making trips to town for supplies in those last months, bringing back packages and spending long hours in the barn. Some suggested he might have been hiding money, though Ruth knew they'd never had enough to hide. Others whispered about love letters from another woman, but Ruth dismissed those rumors with a laugh. Thomas Anderson had barely had enough charm for one woman, let alone two. After breakfast, Ruth found herself drawn to the old photo album she kept in the living room bookshelf. She blew dust from its cover and settled into her recliner, turning, pages filled with memories. Thomas at 25 when they'd first bought the farm, standing proudly beside the very barn that now held his secret. Ruth, young and slim, holding baby David with Karen toddling beside her. Family picnics, Christmases, anniversaries, a life captured in fading photographs. She paused at a picture taken just a year before Thomas got sick. They were standing together at the county fair where Thomas's corn had won second prize. His arm was around her waist, and they were both laughing at something now forgotten. They looked happy. They had been happy. Whatever waited in that barn, Ruth decided, couldn't change that. The phone rang, startling her from her memories. It was Karen. "Mom? You okay? I've been thinking about you all morning." Ruth smiled. Karen had always been the sensitive one, seeming to know when something was on her mother's mind. "I'm fine, honey. Just looking at old pictures." "Today's the day, isn't it? 35 years. You remembered." "Of course I remembered. Do you want me to come over? I could be there in an hour." Ruth considered the offer. Part of her wanted her daughter's support, but another part, a stronger part, felt this was something she needed to do alone, at least initially. "Not just yet. Let me see what's there first. Then I'll call you." Karen was quiet for a moment. "Okay, Mom, but promise you'll call right after, no matter what you find." "I promise," Ruth said and meant it. After hanging up, Ruth finished her coffee and stood at the kitchen window, gazing at the barn. It had weathered the years. Well, all things considered. Thomas had built it solid, like everything he'd done in his life. The red paint had faded to a rusty brown, and ivy crept up one side, but its structure remained sound. The key to the heavy padlock had sat in Ruth's jewelry box for 35 years, untouched. Thomas had placed it there himself the day before. He died. "When it's time," he'd said, his breath labored, "this key will unlock everything. But not until then, Ruth. Promise me." Now, Ruth retrieved the key and held it in her palm. It felt heavier than it should, weighted with decades of questions. Outside, the summer air was thick with humidity, promising another scorching day. Ruth walked slowly down the worn path to the barn, her heart beating a little faster with each step. Birds chirped in the old oak tree that shaded the eastern side of the building. A distant tractor rumbled from the neighboring farm. Everything felt so ordinary, yet to Ruth the world seemed to hold its breath. The padlock was rusted, but the key slid in smoothly enough. Ruth hesitated, her hand trembling slightly. For 35 years, she had honored her husband's strange request without question. Now, standing before the moment of revelation, she felt a sudden reluctance. What if the mystery was better than the truth? "Don't be silly, old woman," she muttered to herself. Thomas wouldn't have made her wait all this time for something disappointing. Whatever lay behind these doors, he had meant it as a gift, not a burden. With that thought firmly in mind, Ruth turned the key. The lock resisted at first, then gave way with a definitive click that seemed to echo in the stillness. She removed it from the hasp and pulled open the right-hand door, wincing at the loud creak of hinges unused for 3.5 decades. Dust motes danced in the shaft of sunlight that pierced the darkness within. Ruth blinked, allowing her eyes to adjust, trying to make sense of what she was seeing. The barn had always been Thomas's domain, a place for tools and farm equipment, for fixing machinery and storing hay. But what stood before her now was something entirely different. The interior had been transformed. The rough wooden walls had been paneled and painted a warm cream color. The dirt floor was now wooden, with a large, faded but still beautiful Persian rug in the center. There was furniture, a small sofa, 2 armchairs, bookshelves lined with volumes, and a writing desk by the window. It looked like a cozy living room, frozen in time. Ruth stepped inside, her legs suddenly unsteady. On the desk sat a thick envelope with her name written in Thomas's distinctive handwriting. Beside it stood a small wooden box and a framed photograph of the two of them on their wedding day. As she moved further in, Ruth noticed other things. A record player with a stack of vinyl albums, all her favorites from their younger days. A small cabinet that, when opened, revealed a collection of photo albums and journals, and mounted on the far wall, a beautiful hand-carved sign that read, "Ruth's Reading Room." Ruth's knees weakened, and she sank onto one of the armchairs, dust rising around her. Her mind raced, trying to piece together what this all meant. Thomas had created this space for her, but why keep it secret for 35 years? With shaking hands, she reached for the envelope on the desk. Inside was a letter, several pages long, the paper yellowed with age. She recognized Thomas's handwriting immediately, and could almost hear his voice as she began to read. "My dearest Ruth, if you're reading this, then you've kept your promise, as I knew you would. 35 years is a long time to wait, and I thank you for honoring my odd request." Ruth felt tears welling in her eyes as she continued reading, finally understanding the secret her husband had kept all those years ago, and why he had asked her to wait so long before discovering it. Ruth's hands trembled as she held Thomas's letter. The paper felt delicate, like it might crumble in her fingers. Sunlight streamed through the small window of the transformed barn, illuminating dust particles that danced in the air around her. "My dearest Ruth," the letter continued, "I know you must have wondered all these years what secret this old barn could possibly hold. I'm sorry for the mystery, but I had my reasons, which I hope will make sense to you now. When the doctor told me I had 6 months to live, my first thought wasn't about my own death. It was about you, about the life you would have without me. We'd spent over 40 years side by side, and the thought of you alone in our house, surrounded by all our memories, broke my heart more than my diagnosis. Ruth paused, wiping a tear from her cheek. Even after 35 years, the memory of those final months with Thomas still ached like a bruise. So I decided to create something for you. Not just a gift, but a purpose. A reason for you to look forward, not back. This room is part of that purpose, but not all of it. Ruth looked around at the cozy space Thomas had created. The bookshelves were filled with novels, mysteries and romances that she'd always enjoyed but rarely had time for when the farm demanded so much attention. The record collection contained all her favorites: Patsy Cline, Johnny Cash, Elvis Presley. Thomas had remembered everything she loved. She returned to the letter, her curiosity growing with each paragraph. You're probably wondering why I made you wait 35 years. The answer is simple yet complicated. I wanted to give you something that would arrive when you needed it most. Not when grief was fresh. You had our children for that time. Not in the middle years when you would be finding your way in a new life without me. But later, when the children were grown with families of their own, when the house might feel too empty, when you might be wondering what comes next in your story. Remember how we always talked about traveling after retirement? About all the places we wanted to see but never had the money for while raising kids and keeping the farm running? Well, I couldn't give you those travels while I was alive, but maybe I can help make them happen now. Ruth's breath caught. Thomas had never been one for surprises. He'd been steady, predictable. It was one of the things she'd loved most about him. This secret room, this mysterious letter. It was so unlike the man she'd known. Opened the wooden box on the desk. Ruth set down the letter and reached for the small wooden box. It was about the size of a cigar box with a simple brass latch. Inside, she found a bank book and a stack of papers. The bank book showed a balance that made her gasp. $200,000? She whispered in disbelief. She returned to the letter, seeking explanation. When my father died, he left me a small insurance policy that I never told you about. It wasn't much, just $5,000. But instead of putting it into the farm or using it for bills, I decided to invest it. My friend Jack down at the bank helped me set up an account. We started small, reinvested the earnings, and added a little whenever I could spare it. Over time it grew. I made Jack promise to continue managing the investments after I was gone. The papers in the box will explain everything. How much is there now, how it's invested, and how you can access it. It's all yours, Ruth. No strings attached, but I do have a suggestion if you'll humor a dead man's wishes. Ruth shook her head in amazement. Thomas had never shown any interest in investments or financial planning. He'd been a farmer through and through, more comfortable with soil than stocks. This hidden side of him was a revelation. Take some of that money and travel. See the Grand Canyon at sunrise like we always talked about. Visit the ocean, either one, your choice. Go to Nashville and listen to country music in those famous honky-tonks. Do all the things we said someday too, and use this room I've made. For you, it's your space now. For reading, for thinking, for remembering if you want to, but mostly for dreaming about what comes next. Ruth glanced again at the cozy armchair, the bookshelves, the record player. Thomas had created a sanctuary. For her, a place that was just hers. Now there's one more thing. Look behind the bookshelf on the far wall. Ruth set down the letter and crossed to the bookshelf Thomas had indicated. It seemed fixed in place, but when she examined it more closely, she noticed small wheels at its base. With some effort, she managed to roll it aside, revealing a door she hadn't noticed before. The door opened into what had once been the back section of the barn. This space hadn't been finished like the reading room. It remained rough-hewn wood and concrete floor, but it had been meticulously organized. Along one wall stood a workbench with tools hanging above it, each one outlined in paint so its proper place was clear. On the opposite wall were shelves containing mason jars filled with nails, screws, and other hardware, all neatly labeled in Thomas's handwriting. But what drew Ruth's eye was the object in the center of the room, covered with a large canvas tarp. It was big, the size of a small car. and Ruth's heart began to race as she approached it. With trembling hands, she pulled back the tarp to reveal what lay beneath. A 1957 Chevy Bel Air, painted sky blue and white, its chrome trim gleaming even. In the dim light, Ruth's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh, Thomas," she whispered. She hurried back to the letter, seeking explanation for this most surprising gift. "Do you remember our first date, Ruth? I picked you up in my cousin's borrowed Chevy Bel Air. You said it was the most beautiful car you'd ever seen. I promised someday I'd buy you one of your own, but somehow life always had other plans for our money. Well, I finally kept that promise. I found this one about a year before I got sick. It was in rough shape, but I've been fixing it up in secret. I think I've got it running pretty well, but Jack's son, he's a mechanic now, promised to check it over once you find it. His number is with the papers in the box. The car is registered in your name. The papers are in the glove compartment. It's yours to drive or to sell, whatever makes you happy." Ruth sank back into the armchair, overwhelmed by Thomas's gifts and the planning that had gone into them. All those hours he'd spent in the barn during his final months, she'd assumed he was just keeping busy, distracting himself from his illness. Instead, he'd been creating this legacy, this final expression of his love. "Why 35 years, Thomas?" she murmured, returning to the letter. "You're probably still wondering about the 35-year wait. Part of it was financial. I wanted the investments to grow. Part of it was practical. I wasn't sure how long the car would sit unused, and I worried about maintenance issues. But mostly, my love, it was because I wanted to give you a second beginning when you might need it most. At our age, 35, years means you'd be in your 70s when you found all this. Old enough to have lived a full life without me, young enough still to use these gifts to create new memories. I hope I timed it right. I hope this finds you well and brings you joy. One last thing, Ruth. In the glove compartment of the car, there's an envelope with the deed to a small cottage on Lake Murray. It's nothing fancy, but it's paid for, and it's yours. Jack's been looking after it, renting it out to cover the taxes and maintenance. He'll explain everything. I always promised to take you to the lake someday. Now you can go anytime you want." Ruth set the letter down and closed her eyes, letting tears flow freely down her cheeks. Even from beyond the grave, after 35 years, Thomas was still taking care of her, still keeping his promises. The sound of tires on gravel broke through her thoughts. Ruth wiped her eyes and stood, making her way to the barn door. A car was coming up the driveway, Karen's blue sedan. Ruth checked her watch, surprised to realize she'd been in the barn for over 2 hours. Karen stepped out of the car, concern written across her face. "Mom? Are you okay? I got worried when you didn't call." Ruth looked at her daughter, then back at the transformed barn with its hidden treasures. A smile spread across her face, not the sad, wistful smile she'd worn so often since Thomas died, but a genuine, joyful one that reached all the way to her eyes. "I'm more than okay," she said, reaching out to take Karen's hand. "Come see what your father left for us. It's time for a new adventure." Karen stood in the middle of the reading room, turning slowly to take in every detail. Her eyes were wide, with wonder, and occasionally she would reach out to touch something. A book spine, the record player, the frame of her parents' wedding photo, as if making sure it was all real. "I can't believe Dad did all this," she said softly. "He never mentioned a word to me." Ruth sat in the armchair, Thomas's letter folded carefully in her lap. "Your father was always full of surprises. Just when I thought I knew everything about him, he'd reveal another layer." Karen picked up one of the photo albums from the cabinet and opened it. "Oh my goodness, Mom, look at these." She brought the album over. "These aren't just our family photos. There are pictures in here I've never seen before." Ruth examined the pages. Karen was right. Among the familiar family snapshots were photographs she barely remembered taking. Thomas fishing at the creek, Ruth hanging laundry on the line with baby Karen in a basket nearby, the two of them dancing in the kitchen, caught by someone's camera when they weren't looking. He must have collected these from everyone. Your Aunt Betsy, his fishing buddies, neighbors, Ruth marveled. He was building a whole history for me to remember. They spent the next hour exploring the barn's treasures together. Karen exclaimed, over the Chevy, running her hand along its polished fender. Dad used to talk about that first date car all the time. I remember him pointing them out whenever we'd see one on the road. Ruth nodded, remembering those moments too. He'd always say, there goes our dream car, Ruthie, and I'd laugh and tell him our real dream was getting you kids through college. Karen grew quiet, flipping through the paperwork from the wooden box. Mom, do you understand what's in here? This is a lot of money. I know, Ruth said. Ruth, I can hardly believe it myself. And a lake house? All these years we could have been. Ruth shook her head. No, honey. Your father had a plan, and I think he was right about the timing. If he'd left all this to me right after he died, I wouldn't have appreciated it the same way. I was too busy raising you kids, keeping the farm going, and later helping with your children. She smiled at her daughter. This is exactly when I needed it, when the house got too quiet, when the days started feeling too long. Karen wiped away a tear. He knew you so well. 35 years, Ruth mused. He planned for me to have 35 years without him, and then start something new. She stood up, suddenly feeling more energetic than she had in years. Well, I don't intend to waste a minute of what he's given me. They called David next, putting him on speakerphone to share the discovery. He was skeptical at first, then astonished as they described the contents of the barn. I'm coming down this weekend, he declared. I have to see this for myself. Do you think that car actually runs? Only one way to find out, Ruth said with a confidence that surprised her. The next day, as promised in Thomas's letter, they called Jack's son Bill at the local garage. He remembered the arrangement his father had made with Thomas all those years ago, and came out to the farm that very afternoon. Bill was in his 50s now, with gray streaking his beard, but Ruth still saw the shadow of the young man who used to help Thomas with farm equipment repairs. He whistled when he saw the Chevy. Mr. Anderson sure knew what he was doing, Bill said, running expert hands over the engine. He rebuilt this beauty from the ground up. He looked at Ruth with respect in his eyes. Dad told me about the arrangement, but I never knew what was actually in here. Mr. Anderson swore us both to secrecy. Can you get it running? Ruth asked. Bill grinned. Ma'am, I think it's already running. Let's find out. He slid into the driver's seat, put the key in the ignition, and turned it. After a moment's hesitation, the engine rumbled to life, settling into a smooth purr that filled the barn. Ruth clapped her hands in delight. Karen hugged her mother's shoulders, both of them beaming at the sound. Battery's still good, Bill noted, with surprise. He must have set up some kind of trickle charger. Your husband thought of everything, Mrs. Anderson. Yes, Ruth said softly. He certainly did. After Bill left, promising to return in a few days to give the car a more thorough inspection, Ruth and Karen moved more of Thomas's treasures into the house. The photo albums, the records, some of the books. The reading room would remain as Thomas had designed it, but Ruth wanted these pieces of him closer to her everyday life. That evening, after Karen had gone home to her own family, Ruth sat at her kitchen table with a cup of tea, making lists. Places to go, things to see, dreams to fulfill. Thomas had given her the means to do all the things they'd talked about over the years but never managed to accomplish. The Grand Canyon, Nashville, the ocean. She decided on the Atlantic, since it was closer. And of course, the lake house. She'd never been much of a traveler, but now the idea filled her with excitement rather than anxiety. Her planning was interrupted by a knock at the door. It was Nancy from next door, her closest neighbor and friend for the past 20 years. I saw all the commotion today, Nancy said, setting an apple pie on the counter. Karen's car, then Bill from the garage. Everything okay? Ruth smiled. Everything is wonderful, Nancy. Sit down. You won't believe what Thomas did. She told her friend everything, the reading room, the car, the investments, the lake house. Nancy listened with growing amazement. Ruth Anderson, you're sitting on a gold mine. Of love, Nancy said when Ruth had finished. 35 years in the making, it's like something out of a movie. It doesn't feel real yet, Ruth admitted. I keep thinking I'll wake up and it will all have been a dream. Nancy reached across the table and squeezed her hand. It's real. And you deserve every bit of it. She glanced at the lists Ruth had been making. So what are you going to do first? Ruth hadn't decided yet. The possibilities seemed endless and slightly overwhelming after decades of familiar routine. I'm not sure. What would you do? Nancy didn't hesitate. I'd drive that beautiful car straight to that lake house and sit on the porch watching the sunset with a glass of wine. The image was so vivid, so appealing that Ruth made up her mind on the spot. That's exactly what I'll do, as soon as Bill gives the car his blessing. You should go this weekend, Nancy suggested. David's coming. Down anyway, right? Make it a family trip. Let him drive if you're nervous about handling that big car. Ruth considered this, then shook her head. No. Thomas meant for this to be my adventure. The kids can visit later, but the first time I want to do it myself. Nancy looked surprised, then pleased. Ruth Anderson, I do believe you've got your spark back. The next few days passed in a flurry of activity. Bill returned and pronounced the Chevy roadworthy, though he insisted on changing the fluids and checking the brakes before he'd let Ruth drive it. Jack from the bank, now retired but still sharp, came by with more information about the lake house and the investments Thomas had made. He was quite specific about everything, Jack explained, showing Ruth documents that outlined Thomas's plans in meticulous detail. The house has been rented out to the same family for the past 15 years. Good people, teachers. Their lease is up next month, which means the timing is perfect for you to take possession. He thought of everything, Ruth marveled. Jack nodded. Thomas was an extraordinary man, not flashy, not one to draw attention to himself, but he had a depth to him that few people recognized. He hesitated, then added, He loved you very much, Ruth. I've never seen anyone plan so carefully for someone else's happiness. On Friday morning, 6 days after opening the barn, Ruth stood in her driveway next to the gleaming Chevy. She'd packed a small suitcase, a cooler with sandwiches and drinks, and a road map, though Bill had installed a GPS device for her as well. Karen and her husband Joe had come to see her off, along with Nancy and a few other neighbors who'd heard the remarkable story. You sure you don't want company? Karen asked for the third time, worry creasing her forehead. It's a 2-hour drive to the lake. I'm sure, Ruth said firmly. I've been driving for 60 years. I think I can manage a little road trip. She hugged her daughter. I'll call when I get there, and you can all come visit next weekend. With one last wave, Ruth slid behind the wheel of the Chevy. The leather seat embraced her like an old friend. She adjusted the mirrors, fastened her seatbelt, and turned the key. The engine came to life with that same satisfying rumble she remembered from their first date, when Thomas had picked her up in his cousin's car, his hair slicked back and his smile nervous but eager. Well, Thomas, she said softly as she put the car in gear, let's go see what else you've been keeping from me all these years. As the Chevy rolled down the driveway, Ruth felt a curious mixture of emotions, grief and joy, loss and discovery, an ending and a beginning, all wrapped up together. 35 years ago, she'd made a promise. Today, that promise was leading her to places she'd never imagined she'd go. And Thomas, in his quiet, steadfast way, was still by her side for the journey. The Chevy handled like a dream on the open road. Ruth had been worried that she might find it difficult to drive such a large car after years of using her small, practical sedan, but Thomas had adjusted everything perfectly. The seat was at the right height for her, the steering wheel turned with just the right amount of resistance, and the engine's rumble was comforting rather than intimidating. As miles of countryside rolled past her windows, Ruth felt a strange sensation bubbling up inside her. It took her several minutes to recognize it as pure, unadulterated joy. When was the last time she had felt this way? Not just content, not just peaceful, but actually joyful? She turned on the radio, delighted to find that Thomas had installed a modern system that looked vintage but could play her favorite stations. Country music filled the car, and Ruth found herself singing along, her voice growing stronger with each mile. The GPS announced that she was 30 miles from Lake Murray. Ruth checked her gas gauge, still 3/4 full, and decided to stop at the next town for a quick break. She pulled into a small diner called Rosie's and parked the Chevy in a spot where she could see it through the window. Inside, she ordered coffee and a slice of pie. The waitress, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, whistled when Ruth mentioned the car was hers. "That's some vehicle you've got there," she said, refilling Ruth's coffee cup. "My daddy used to have one just like it. Don't see many of those on the road these days, especially not in that condition." "My husband restored it," Ruth said, feeling a surge of pride. It was a surprise. "Well, he did a beautiful job." "You're a lucky woman." Ruth smiled. "Yes, I am." Back on the road, Ruth's thoughts turned to the lake house. According to Jack, it was a small 2-bedroom cottage on the quieter side of Lake Murray, with a private dock and a screened porch. Thomas had bought it through a bank auction the same year he'd found the Chevy, getting it for a bargain price, because it needed work. Like the car, he'd been restoring it secretly, using the skills he'd developed over a lifetime of maintaining their farmhouse. Jack had given her photos, but they were from years ago, showing a simple white cottage with blue shutters and a stone path leading to the water. The renters had maintained it well, he'd assured her, even making some improvements with Thomas's approval, communicated through Jack over the years. As Ruth approached the lake, the landscape changed. Rolling farmland gave way to more densely wooded areas, and occasionally she caught glimpses of blue water through the trees. The GPS directed her to turn onto increasingly smaller roads until she found herself on a narrow lane marked Pine Point Road. "Your destination is on the right in 500 feet, the GPS announced. Ruth slowed the Chevy, peering through the trees. And then she saw it. A mailbox with Anderson painted on the side in faded letters. Beyond it, a gravel driveway disappeared into the pines. Her heart pounding, Ruth turned into the driveway. It wound through the trees for about 100 yards before opening into a clearing. And there, just as in the photos but somehow more perfect than she had imagined, stood the cottage. It was exactly as Jack had described. White clapboard with blue shutters, a covered porch across the front, and beyond it, the sparkling blue of Lake Murray. What the photos hadn't captured was the feeling of the place, peaceful, welcoming, as if it had been waiting for her all these years. Ruth parked the Chevy and sat for a moment, gathering her thoughts. Then she reached for the envelope Jack had given her, which contained the keys and some information about the property. With slightly trembling hands, she opened the cottage door. Inside, sunlight streamed through windows that faced the lake, illuminating a cozy living room with a stone fireplace. The furniture was simple but comfortable looking. A sofa, 2 armchairs, a coffee table, and a small dining set near a kitchen that opened off to one side. Everything was clean and well maintained, with a slightly lived-in feel that made it immediately welcoming. Ruth walked slowly through the cottage, taking in every detail. The larger bedroom had a queen-sized bed with a handmade quilt and windows that offered views of both the sunrise and the lake. The smaller room had twin beds and bookshelves built into the walls. The bathroom was simple, but had been updated, with a modern shower. But it was the screened porch at the back that took Ruth's breath away. It ran the full width of the cottage and was furnished with wicker chairs, a small table, and a porch swing big enough for 2. Beyond it, a stone path led down to a private dock where a small rowboat was tied. Ruth sank into the porch swing, overwhelmed by emotions. Thomas had created this haven for her, a place of peace and beauty where she could start a new chapter of her life. How had he known all those years ago exactly what she would need at this moment? A knock at the door startled her from her thoughts. Wiping away tears she hadn't realized she was shedding, Ruth went to answer it. An older man with weathered skin and gray hair stood on the porch, a fishing hat in his hands. "Mrs. Anderson?" he asked. "I'm Pete Wilson. I live in the next cottage. Over." He gestured vaguely to the right. "Jack called and said you might be coming today. Thought I'd stop by and welcome you to Pine Point." Ruth invited him in, grateful for the distraction from her emotional moment. Pete declined a coffee but sat at the kitchen table while Ruth made herself a cup. "So you're Thomas Anderson's widow," he said. "Jack told me the story, how your husband set all this up years ago. Pretty remarkable." "Did you ever meet Thomas?" Ruth asked, curious about this connection to her husband's secret life. Pete shook his head. "No, ma'am. Jack handled everything with the renters and maintenance, but I feel like I know him a bit from this place. A man puts his heart into a property like this, you can see his character in the details." Ruth nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. The cottage was so perfectly Thomas. Practical, comfortable, without pretension, but with careful attention to the things that truly mattered. The Millers, the family that's been renting, they've been good neighbors. Pete continued. "Teachers, both of them. They're moving to Columbia for new jobs. They left everything spotless for you." "I'll have to thank them," Ruth said. "They left a note in the drawer there," Pete pointed, "and a casserole in the fridge. Lake people take care of each other," he added with a smile. After Pete left, promising to take her fishing if she was interested, Ruth explored the cottage more thoroughly. She found the Miller's note, thanking her for allowing them to live in such a beautiful place for so many years, and expressing their hope that she would love it as much as they had. In the master bedroom closet, she discovered a cardboard box with her name on it. Inside were more of Thomas's surprises: a fishing rod and tackle box, a pair of binoculars for bird watching, several books about local wildlife, and a leather-bound journal with blank pages. A note tucked inside the journal read, "For your new adventures. I always loved hearing your thoughts. Write them down now, even though I can't listen anymore." Ruth hugged the journal to her chest, feeling closer to Thomas than she had in years. He had known her so well. Her love of nature, her unspoken wish to write down her thoughts, her need for both solitude and community. As evening approached, Ruth took a glass of wine out to the porch swing, just as Nancy had suggested. The lake was turning golden in the setting sun, and birds called to each other as they settled in for the night. A light breeze carried the scent of pine and water. She called Karen as promised, assuring her daughter that she had arrived safely, and that the cottage was perfect. Then she called David, who was on his way to the farm, and promised to visit the lake house the following weekend. After the calls, Ruth sat in peaceful silence, watching darkness fall over the lake. Stars appeared, reflected in the still water. From somewhere across the lake came the sound of laughter and music, other cottages, other lives. But here, in this moment, Ruth felt perfectly content to be alone with her thoughts and the memory of Thomas. She opened the journal and began to write. "Dear Thomas, today I drove our dream car to our dream cottage by the lake. 35 years. After you left, you've given me a new beginning. How did you know exactly what I would need? How did you plan so perfectly for a future you wouldn't see? I wish you could be here with me. I wish we could sit together on this porch swing, watching the moon rise over the lake. But somehow I feel you are here, in every corner of this cottage, in every detail you planned, and every surprise you left for me to find. Tonight I'm beginning a new chapter. The story of us isn't over. It's just changing, taking a turn I never expected. And I'm not afraid. Because even after 35 years, you're still showing me the way forward." Ruth closed the journal and looked out at the starlit lake. Tomorrow she would explore the area, meet more neighbors, maybe even try out that rowboat. The future stretched before her, full of possibilities she hadn't imagined just a week ago. Thomas had given her one final precious gift, a new purpose. And Ruth intended to embrace it with her whole heart. 1 year had passed since Ruth had opened the barn door and discovered Thomas's gifts. The seasons had cycled through, summer fading to autumn, winter blanketing the lake in stillness, and spring bringing renewal once again. Now summer had returned, and with it, the anniversary of her discovery. Ruth sat on the dock at Lake Murray, her bare feet dangling in the cool water. The morning sun sparkled on the lake's surface, and somewhere nearby, a loon called to its mate. She had come to recognize the distinct sounds of lake life, the different bird calls, the splash of fish jumping, the gentle lapping of waves against the shore when a boat passed in the distance. The cottage had become her second home. She split her time between the farm, which she couldn't quite bring herself to sell, and this peaceful retreat by the water. David had initially suggested she choose one place or the other. "It's a lot for you to maintain, Mom." But Ruth had discovered an energy and independence she hadn't known she possessed. "Your father didn't leave me all this so I could settle for half of it," she had told her son with a firmness that surprised them both. The Chevy had served her faithfully on her journeys back and forth. Bill from the garage had taught her basic maintenance, and Ruth took pride in keeping the car as Thomas would have wanted it, gleaming and purring like a contented cat. But today was special. Today the whole family was coming to the lake for a celebration. Karen and Joe would arrive first with their children, followed by David and his family driving down from Ohio. Even Nancy from back home was making the trip. Ruth had spent yesterday preparing food, making beds in the cottage and the small guest cabin she'd had built on the property, and setting up tables on the large deck she'd added last fall. As if summoned by her thoughts, she heard the crunch of tires on gravel. Ruth stood, brushing off her shorts, and walked up from the dock. Karen's minivan was pulling in beside the Chevy. "Grandma!" 10-year-old Lily was out of the car before it fully stopped, racing toward Ruth with open arms. Behind her came her brother Ben, more restrained at 14 but still smiling broadly. Hugs were exchanged, bags were unloaded, and soon the quiet cottage was filled with the happy noise of family. Karen immediately took over the kitchen, shooing Ruth away when she tried to help. "This is your day, Mom. Let us do the work." By noon, David's family had arrived, adding his wife Teresa and their twin boys to the mix. The cousins immediately headed for the lake, with strict instructions to wait for an adult before swimming. Nancy arrived last, bearing a homemade apple pie and news from the farm. "The Johnsons' youngest got married last weekend," she reported, as she helped Ruth set out plates on the deck. "And old Mr. Finley finally sold that field he's been trying to unload for years." Ruth listened with interest, but she found that the farm news didn't tug at her heart the way it once might have. Her life had expanded beyond those familiar boundaries. After lunch, as the children played a noisy game of tag around the yard, the adults gathered on the deck with cold drinks. Ruth looked around at her family, her children, their spouses, her grandchildren, and felt a wave of gratitude so strong it nearly brought tears to her eyes. This was what Thomas had wanted for her. Not just the material gifts, but these moments of joy and connection. "Mom," David said, setting down his glass, "we've been talking and we have something for you." He glanced at Karen, who nodded encouragingly. Ruth raised an eyebrow. "What's this about?" Karen reached into her bag and pulled out a large envelope. "We found something in Dad's things, something we set aside years ago because we didn't understand its importance." "What things?" Ruth asked, confused. "I thought we went through everything of his after he died." "Almost everything," David explained. "There was a box of papers in his workshop that I took home thinking they were just old farm records. I was going through them last month while cleaning out my garage and found this." Karen handed the envelope to Ruth. Inside was a thick packet of yellowed papers held together with a faded ribbon. On top was a note in Thomas's handwriting. "For Ruth, to be given on the first anniversary of the barn opening." Ruth's hands trembled slightly as she untied the ribbon. "He thought of everything," she whispered. Inside were pages upon pages of Thomas's handwriting, dates, notes, sketches, and what appeared to be journal entries. As Ruth began to read, she realized what she was holding, the complete story of Thomas's secret projects, documented from the very beginning. "June 12, 1986, she read aloud. "Doctor gave me the news today. 6 months, maybe a year if I'm lucky. Haven't told Ruth yet. Need time to think, to plan. She'll be on her own, and that scares me more than dying." Ruth paused, her throat tight. She'd never known exactly when Thomas had received his diagnosis. He'd protected her from that too, giving her time to adjust to the idea gradually. "June 15, 1986, she continued. "Had an idea today. Ruth always wanted to travel to see places we couldn't afford to visit while raising the kids. Maybe I can't give her that now. But what if I could give her the means to do it later? Need to talk to Jack at the bank. Page after page documented Thomas's journey, finding the car, discovering the cottage at a bank auction, the countless hours spent restoring both while keeping everything secret from Ruth. He'd written about his hopes and fears, his detailed plans, and most touchingly, his vision of Ruth's future without him. October 3rd, 1987, she read. Getting weaker. Don't think I'll see Christmas, but the car is almost done, and Jack has the investment plan in place. The cottage needs work, but I've arranged for that. Ruth will have it all someday, when the time is right. 35 years. It sounds like forever, but it will pass. And then she'll have a new beginning. Tears flowed freely down Ruth's cheeks now. Karen moved to sit beside her, placing a comforting arm around her shoulders. He planned, it all so carefully, Ruth said, her voice thick with emotion. Every detail, right down to this moment, all of us together celebrating a year later. That was Dad, David said softly, always thinking 10 steps ahead. Ruth nodded, wiping her eyes. He knew I'd need time to grieve, time to find my footing, time to be ready for changes. 35 years was exactly right. She looked up at her children. Your father was the wisest man I've ever known. After dinner, as the sun began to set over the lake, the family gathered on the dock. Ruth had asked each of them to bring a small memento of Thomas, something that reminded them of him. One by one, they shared their memories. David had brought his father's old pocket knife, the one Thomas had used to whittle small animals for the children. He taught me patience with this knife, David said, how to look at a piece of wood and see what was hiding inside it. Karen had brought the faded recipe card for Thomas's famous biscuits, written in his neat handwriting. Sunday morning breakfast, she recalled. He'd get up early and have these ready by the time we came downstairs. The grandchildren shared too. Drawings he had kept, a baseball he had taught them to throw, a small wooden treasure box he had made for Lily's 5th birthday. When everyone had spoken, Ruth stood at the edge of the dock. In her hands she held the last page of Thomas's journal. Thomas wrote this the day before he died, she told them. It was his final entry. She read the words aloud. December 18th, 1987. The doctor says it's a matter of days now. Ruth suspects, but she's being strong for me. My beautiful, brave Ruth, I hope I've done enough. I hope when she opens that barn door 35 years from now, she'll understand how much I loved her, how much I wanted her to have joy and adventure, even without me. If love could build a bridge across time, I've built the strongest one. I know how, Ruth, my darling, when you read this, know that I am watching over you. Live fully, love openly, travel widely, and remember that what we shared doesn't end with my last breath. It continues in every sunset you watch, every new place you discover, every moment of joy you embrace. Our love story isn't over. It's just changing chapters. As Ruth finished reading, the setting sun painted the lake in shades of gold and pink. A gentle breeze stirred the water, creating ripples that caught the light. I think, Ruth said softly, that Thomas would want us to celebrate, not mourn. He gave all of us, such an incredible gift. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small bottle of champagne and plastic cups she had hidden there earlier. With David's help, she poured a small amount for each adult and sparkling cider for the children. To Thomas, she said, raising her cup, for teaching us that love transcends time. To Grandpa, the children echoed. As they sipped their drinks in the fading light, Ruth felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The past year had been a journey of discovery, not just of Thomas's gifts, but of her own strength and capacity for new beginnings. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Ruth sat alone on the porch swing. The moon cast a silver path across the lake, and crickets sang in the darkness. She opened her journal, the one Thomas had left for her, now half filled with a year's worth of thoughts and experiences. Dear Thomas, she wrote, today marks 1 year since I opened the barn door and found your gifts. But the real gift wasn't the car or the cottage or even the money. It was the future you imagined for me. a future filled with family, with new experiences, with joy. I've driven our dream car to the Grand Canyon. I've watched the sun rise over the Atlantic Ocean. I've stood in the Grand Ole Opry and listened to country music just like we always talked about. And with each new adventure, you've been with me. Thank you for loving me enough to let me go, even while giving me a way to hold on. Thank you for knowing me better than I knew myself. Most of all, thank you for this second chance at living fully. The barn door opened to so much more than I could have imagined. It opened to the rest of my life. Ruth closed the journal and looked out at the moonlit lake. Tomorrow would bring more family time, more laughter, more memories in the making. And after that, who knew? The future stretched before her, full of possibilities, just as Thomas had planned.